everything.
Alright? Potential scarcity has existed for most of human history, or at least most of civilization history. But actually now, because of the level of technology we're at today, we can unleash such a power and a massive... Excuse me,
limits to growth made it clear in the 1980s that that's not the case. Scarcity exists, it's not artificial. Limits to growth.
No, when I say you can create an abundance, I don't mean you necessarily have to create limitless growth.
No, limits to growth is a book.
That's one of the creations of capitalism. The desire for limitless growth creates artificial scarcity.
Just careful how when you talk about scarcity. Limits to growth clear this out.
No, you're conflating two ideas. You're conflating scarcity with
limits to growth is
low levels of growth.
About scarcity.
How are you defining scarcity? Does that mean that every single citizen has enough to eat, has enough, I don't know, social care, has enough medical care? What does it mean? Or does it mean everybody has a large SUV, everybody has a massive house? How do you?
Those are not. No one needs those things.
Okay, so but then you can point. You can come to a very fundamental point where you can say everybody just needs for their life just food, water, and some basic shelter, right? So we can stay in like very primal age and live throughout the whole history like that.
We don't have to be like that. As civilization has developed and progressed, human beings have developed their desires and their wants for more and more things.
Right.
When someone wants an SUV, they don't want an SUV. They want status. That's what they want when they want an SUV. Or they want a feeling of safety because they're worried that things are dangerous in their neighborhood.
Or because
so they buy
their
an
neighbor has
SUV,
it.
right? That's what they really want. You've got to look, and this is just a word of advice about human relationships in general. People, when they say they want something, they want that something to get to a human need. There's a universal human need underpinning that.
They also want it to be better off than their neighbour and seem to be better off than their neighbour.
That's not true. That's simply not
Again, that's
true.
not necessarily true. That tends to happen in unequal societies. In very unequal societies, you have a lot more status anxiety and a desire to be better than your neighbour. But in a relatively equal society, that kind of anxiety is less. For example, if you look at like more equal countries in Europe, France and Britain are like a good example of this. France is much more equal than Britain in terms of its wealth differences between the gap between the richest and the poorest. It's much less. France is somewhere in the middle. Somewhere near the bottom is somewhere like Sweden. Sweden is really like the gap is. It's there. It's definitely a gap, but it's not near as big as Britain. They have less of anxiety. They have less mental illness, depression, divorce. All of these things are less.
The rich have gone abroad.
They just have less of that feeling.
If we agree that
but I wanted to go back to something you said. Capitalism creates scarcity because it needs constant growth. It needs constant growth because different businesses are competing with each other for market share. And the easiest way to expand your market share is by competing with others. It's grow or die. That's how capitalism works. There's big banks who behave in that way, who are constantly expanding, like you said, expansionists. They're doing that. That's the law of survival in the capitalist system. That is how the system works. That creates scarcity.
Otherwise, I wouldn't.
You think, oh wait, no, doesn't that create growth? Doesn't that create more abundance? But no, not necessarily. It really doesn't. For example, I'll talk about the housing market. That thrives on scarcity. That artificial scarcity you see in London to keep the level of housing low.
Gosh, it creates difficulties.
You keep the housing supply low. Or there is already a huge housing supply in London, but you just keep the access away from the public. You just keep it cordoned off. That keeps the price of housing high in London. You don't have to be an economist to work this out very straight. You just have to understand basic supply and demand. I worked in real estate for a while, and I remember I just read articles about how the system worked, so I could work there.
It's not the system.
And I remember reading an article about Telford Homes. It was in the Irish Times. They were saying Telford Homes is doing remarkably well. Their profits are going through the roof, and we think this is because of the housing crisis in London. The housing demand is so high, is what keeps the price. That's artificial scarcity.
Yeah,
so when you keep the level of...
There's a balancing mechanism, because in the end people will move to the outskirts and to where it's cheaper, to Kent, to
But they shouldn't have to do that.
Well, that's
families who have lived in London their whole lives. Now this is starting to get more attention in the media because it's affecting middle class people. So the Guardian will report something when it starts to affect its readers, right? It will start to talk about something seriously. A lot of middle class people have had to leave London now, right? That's when it becomes a problem. What working class people have had to be shoved out of their homes and their neighbourhoods for years to make way for artists and students and so on. They've been doing that for generations. But now it's so bad now that it's affecting nice middle class people, professionals and so on. They have to leave now to live on the outskirts. And now it's become a problem. They have to do something. You've got something like a huge number of people living with their parents still, between the age of 25 and 35, right? It never used to be this many. I should be living by myself. I don't want to live with my
Dude, can I
mum.
ask you a question?
But I have to. I'm 23. I never thought I'd be living with my mum when I was 23. I thought I'd be moved out by the time I was 19, 20. But no, I have to stay because I looked on the internet. I looked at what you could get. If I worked a minimum wage job in Britain, 60 hours a week, then I could just about afford the cheapest single room, unfurnished in London. That's what we're talking about here, right? That's what we're talking about. And I wouldn't be able to put any aside for savings. But I don't want to make this about me. There's a general problem here which you should all think about on a general social level, not at the level of individual people we know. So often we have friends and family who tell us problems and they're individual, we see them as individual cases. But very rarely do we look outside and say this is a huge, widespread national problem. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to do at Speaker's Corner.
There's no solution because, I mean, if the prices came down significantly, there'd be 4 million individual homeowners, mainly owner-occupiers in London, who'd have a massive reduction in wealth and in their...
No.
Is that true?
No, not in wealth, I wouldn't.
Yes, if you had the house prices went down by a third in London to make it more affordable for him and for others, there were 4 million people who lose out.
No,
You
no,
don't
because,
necessarily have to...
no,
yeah.
because your problem is with house prices, it's a totally artificial number. Because if a house is worth £1 million on paper, it's not actually worth £1 million. It's only worth £1 million because someone says it's worth £1 million.
No, because they can sell it for £1 million.
But
it has a location,
the
right?
price of housing is determined by the economic situation of capitalism. It goes up and up.
But you know, I'm sorry, but this is true. Sorry, there's a bubble in London where the housing has been valued far more than it really is.
You can build a house for 200.
Far more than it
Location
should
is
be.
important. London is a good location, but it's going beyond its real value.
If I was to build a house here,
I mean,
for
this is
instance,
a
it would cost me about £70,000 to create a really good house right there. Why can't I do it? Because the ground belongs to the Queen and the ground cannot be bought. And if I had free land, I could build a house almost on my own for very little amount
You
of
wouldn't
money.
be allowed in somebody's back garden, let alone
because
here.
private property.
This is the problem as well. People are living in back gardens, right? They're living in like sheds and they pay £600 a month rent to live in a shed.
Amazing
That should be, at the very least, if the government doesn't, I really, really personally hope Jeremy Corbyn gets into power and creates a more just and sensible, rational housing situation, not just in London but the whole of the UK. I really hope that happens. But until then, right, at the very least, the government should ban people from living in sheds. They should make it illegal to live in a shed.
I think...
It really should. It should just be absolutely legal. No landlord should be allowed to do that. We're going back into like Victorian
It's a London
conditions when we
problem.
allow
You say
that.
the rest of the country, there isn't the same.
No, we've got to
problem.
take into account the London housing market's a different case. I learned this when I worked in housing. Like it's different. Different cities have different. There's no British housing market. There's the London housing market. There's Bristol. There's
also,
North Wales. But there's no national housing market.
Say Corbyn comes in power. What do you like? What action would you suggest to bring down prices? So supply them.
Rent control. Listen, it's not a radical.
And who's going to rent
Rent
out any
control.
property then?
No, I'm a radical left-wing revolutionary.
rent
You don't
out-
have to be a radical left-wing revolutionary though
Who
to
is
think that rent
Who's
control
gonna
is a good
rent out
idea.
any property?
Most Londoners think that rent control is a good idea.
But with
Read
the rent
the
control,
polls.
who's
Read the
gonna
public
rent
opinion
any-
polls and you will see.
Guy.
Most Londoners would like to
rent-
see New York-style rent controls.
Who's
They
gonna
don't
rent
know
any
how
property?
exactly. They're not sure exactly what level of rent control it should be, but they know that there should be there.
But Kai,
They know that it should be there.
Kai, rent control is not the answer. The problem is that the houses could be built, if the council houses were being built like they were in the 1960s, for instance, massive scale, the house prices would go down and the rents would go down because the rents are determined by the house price. If you are a capitalist owner of a property, you know the property is worth £1 million. You can put the £1 million in the bank and get 2 or 3%, but you can get 2 or 3% or 4% by renting the house.
Oh no,
out.
the rental market's also been underpinned by London, not by only the rent.
Well, it doesn't matter
but
where
by the
it-
expectation
It
will
doesn't
go
matter.
up.
If you go up north,
And when it goes down,
if
it's
you
gonna
go
all
up
collapse.
north, the house prices
what
are
it's gonna
half the
collapse.
price,
It's
and
gonna
the
collapse.
rents are half the
I don't
price.
think there's actually
And
really...
there'll be a lot of homeless in London.
There's not really any competition for people who want to buy their own home and kind of rent their own flat kind of among each other. It's among the kind of the very wealthy who own several flats, several homes that they rent out to other people. And I think that's what's causing the competition.
No, it's not
With the
all,
shortage,
I think.
with the shortage, there's not enough of a shortage of housing in London for there to be so much competition. All the competition is caused by kind of people at the top who are competing for the houses which they can then rent to people who could never kind of own their own house. Or
No, there's a
I don't
class
think- yeah.
interest here at stake.
No,
There is a
nothing
class.
bad.
No, there's a class element here. Britain is seething with class warfare. It really is. It doesn't seem like this on the surface. It really doesn't. It's because things have become more complicated now. There's more gradations of class than there used to be. Things are not so simple as they were in Marx's day. There are levels of class status now. Things have become a lot more difficult to navigate. But it is seething with class conflict. It really is. When you've got like thousands of young people who can't move out to live in a decent house, and they're in that sort of middle class bracket, right? They're finding that difficult for exactly the reasons this young man just said. There's a group of home developers who don't want them to be able to move out easily. They know that. They know like that will lower the price of housing that in their respective markets in different parts of London. They don't want that to be the case. They want to keep the crisis going. The market is the crisis. That's for me the situation. The market is the crisis.
I think we all agree.
Something as valuable as housing shouldn't be determined by what you can afford. It should be based on your human rights. You should have a right to housing. This is why I never talk, when I say that the government should build more council homes, I use the word homes. They're not just flats. They're not just buildings or houses. They're homes. They're where people should live. That's what I talk about. You know, you should say like there's a value to things which is beyond the market. There's a use value in a house which transcends the market value for that thing.
We agree with what you're saying about the grotesque housing situation in London. I want to go back to a basic argument where you said cooperation is better than competition, and you cited that like competition increases stress, anxiety, and you pointed out other good points of like the negative externalities that it creates. But I want to ask you a question, which is, do you accept that you can only have true cooperation through enforcement or through violence? So how do you solve the free rider problem or the tragedy of the commons, like this gentleman said, that if there's one country, if there's one community that doesn't abide by the rules of the game, competition, then you have that free rider.
So you've got the free rider problem. And there was a man called Garrett Harding who spoke about the tragedy of the commons. It was the idea that if I have a cow and we have a common shared land, I'm going to let the cow graze on that land, like, you know, as much as...
Do you accept that competition is better or less bad than enforced cooperation? That's my point.
This is a safeguarding issue when you're taking their children.
Very sensible case.
Can I say something, Kai?
Yeah, sorry, I just was a bit distracted.
No, but do you accept that basically a system based on competition is less bad than a system based on enforced cooperation?
No, it has to be
only ever be
enforced.
enforced.
But it doesn't have to be enforced.
Which is usually through violence.
So there's
or
a very
sea of
good
blood.
book by a woman called Eleanor Ostrom. She got a Nobel Prize for her studies of the commons. She went around the world studying common spaces, people share and they cooperate. They're not owning that space privately. So she went to spend time with shepherds in like Switzerland. She went to spend time with she went around America, and there's a lot of common spaces which are opening up in America. She went to, but mainly most of the spaces are in Europe and Asia. She studied the Mongolian steppe as well, where herdsmen share the land there. Now she looked at the oceans as well, how different countries manage common spaces in the ocean. There's no free rider problem. People, again, it goes back to reciprocal altruism. If you treat me well, I treat you well. If I know you're going to look after this land and not like destroy it, and you're going to share it reasonably, I will continue to share it reasonably. And throughout the feudal period, you saw this very, very strong value. You had the right. Everyone had the right to the forest to take acorns and fatten up their cattle and get firewood. It was when that land was enclosed. That's when the beginnings of the problem started. You had first the lords and then later the bourgeoisie started to
deny the free rider problem is to deny
it.
basic free will of humans. It's a really dangerous idea because, like, going back to the basic example of like mating, you said there's enough supply for everyone, but that would imply that there has to be like a central authority to decide who mates who, like arranged marriages. And there will be people who resist because we do have free will.
No,
There's always going to be.
That's a separate issue. You're muddying by bringing in something like arranged marriages. You're muddying.
No, I'm saying
I'm
saying this is an example that's intrinsic to human nature where there is competition. And you said like, no, it doesn't have to be like that. We can have cooperation. How do you enforce that?
They can be competitive and they can be cooperative depending on the situation. Beliefs are what matter here. Beliefs are very powerful. If you very strongly believe that competition is the most efficient way to run things, and it brings out excellence, and it brings out character, then you're gonna try and work to create that. It may not work, but you're gonna ignore that. People have a confirmation bias. They ignore the things that disagree with their worldview, and then they reinforce the things that.
I'm just saying you're overlooking the central authority that's necessary to enforce.
It doesn't have to be a central authority. I'll give you an example of where I think. For example, I differ from this man here. This man here is a Marxist, and I disagree with this young man here. He's a social democrat. I'm neither. I do have a lot of values in common with them. I like to emphasize cooperation over competition. but the way I'd enforce that would be different. So I wouldn't use a state to do that. I would like to see that Britain and the rest of the world move beyond states.
Okay.
I'm not an anarchist either, because anarchists have their own issue with being very individualistic and like thinking on their own individual freedom above everything else. I would like to see local communities run things. I would like to see confederations of local municipalities managing the land in common. I think the land of a neighbourhood should belong to that neighbourhood together. And the way you would see this unfold would be like this. You would have a weekly meeting of that neighbourhood, open to all the people who live in that area, to come and meet and to decide how they want that area to be run. And say, maybe an old lady who runs a shop down the road, say she passes away and she hasn't left her land to anybody, the land will be taken over by the assembly and they will decide how to use it. They would say, okay, well, we don't need this kind of shop, we'll turn this into a cafe or whatever. For me, that would be socialism. When I can walk down the street and I can see every single shop gradually, slowly taken over by the local community, run through direct democratic meetings.
Yeah.
I would say not only is that democratic, that's for me real socialism. Socialism for me is not when the state runs everything.
I really like your communitarian view in an idealistic sense, but the only thing that I would say is that I really do believe that power corrupts. I believe that the fathers of the American Constitution were right, and the rights of Magna Carta to recognise that positions of power always has a tendency to, not in everyone, you can have benevolent leaders and you can have benevolent dictators, but there's always that danger, there's always that risk, so that in any sort of form of hierarchy, the leaders of that community can abuse their power, and that's why that system will break down. It's not practical. I agree that in an idealistic sense.
I'll say why I don't agree with that.
Great, but it's just not feasible.
It was Lord Acton who said power tends to corrupt.
Yeah.
That's where everyone gets the phrase. They leave out the tends because it just doesn't flow off the tongue. It's such a nice way. Power tends to corrupt. Power corrupts. People like to say power corrupts.
You need checks and balances.
Right? But no, not only did Lord Acton not say that power corrupts, he said power tends to corrupt. He said power tends to corrupt. What he meant by that wasn't that we shouldn't empower people. He said we should give people power. In his view, he believed that it should be a constitutional monarchy. A monarchy should have oversight, and he was a liberal. He wanted liberals to have the power, right? And by liberals, he meant like white men who own property, right? That's what a liberal meant back then. With the United States, you're very right to point out that it's not a democracy. You're implying that it's not a democracy, it's a republic. The founding fathers said that it's the rule of the best men. They wanted to be philosopher kings. Read in their own language of the beginning of that republic. It was a republic carved away from old Europe, but taking the best of old Europe. The old idea of a wise ruler who knows best. I would like to see, I don't believe power inherently corrupt. I think when you have lots of power in one place, such as the Prime Minister's seat, then you're going to get very corrupt people attached to that idea of getting that power. For me, it's not that power tends to corrupt, it's that corrupt people tend to be attracted to high amounts of power. For me, that's more realistic. I see that as there's nothing inherently corrupting about power. Like having a lot of power doesn't make you a megalomaniac. It's just that having a lot of power is a very attractive idea to people who are megalomaniacs already. For me, I see that as the more politically accurate way of doing things. So now going back to communalism, I'll just point out quickly, just don't want to be pedantic, but it's not communitarianism. Communitarianism is when I set up a people's garage down my street and I let everybody use it in my area. That's communitarianism, right? It's a very small variation on capitalism where you try and open up some of the goods and services to people on the basis of that sharing. Communalism is a lot more radical. It's a lot more socially reconstructive. And like I said, the problem isn't that power is the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is that not enough people have power. Towns and communities don't have the power. People in their home life don't have political decision-making power. They might go and do yoga and then they feel empowered. They feel like, oh yeah, I feel really empowered, right? But that's spiritual power. That's a different thing we're talking about. It's in a different category of thought. We're not dealing with spiritual empowerment. I'm talking here about political decision-making, the ability to decide.
Isn't that democracy and
That's
voting?
what most people don't have that. So for example, this thing about the banks, Karl Marx was right when he said that Parliament is just the committee for the management of the affairs of the bourgeoisie. They don't care. The Parliament doesn't care whether the banks overstep and pay for pay their people too many bonuses. Do you know that between 2008 and 2012, the 1,000 richest families made enough money to repay back all the money lost during the financial crisis? That was between that period of time. They know that. Government knows that. But they're not acting in the interest of the public. They're acting in their class background. The capitalism and the state is like that in Britain. It's mixed right from the very beginning. The very people exploiting India were sitting in the Houses of Parliament as MPs. You do get to choose who your exploiters are. I get to choose. That's good. That's better than nothing.
You brought up megalomania, which is a psychiatric
right?
I didn't want to get too psychological about
Yeah,
it.
but we're in the age of psychology, right?
Age of anxiety.
Yes.
Thank you so much, guys. See you next week,
So
maybe.
how do you
Have a nice
cope
one.
with a certain amount of sociopaths? And
That kind of leads back to his question,
yes,
doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, the same.
How do you
the same-
recognise it? Do you take
Yeah,
them
the
out?
megalomaniacs, that's a problem in any society.
Yeah.
It's a problem in communalism, it's a problem in Marxism, and it's a problem
Can
in
I-
capitalism. Wherever you are, you'll always have these people who stand up on a podium, they stand up like I'm doing now, and they try and use language to play on people's worst emotions. They try and use fear, they try and use anger, and purely emotion to control
Some people around here.
Some people will do that.
So
There's a
Kai,
point
can
of
I answer
political
this?
strategy.
Can I
Like,
make
for
a-
radicals
can
like
I
you,
make a-
do you
second.
think
I'll
it'll
answer
be
the
more
question, one
effective? Because I agree with you on so much in the idealistic sense, but do you think it'll be more practical instead of going after private property as your aim, or like residential communities, like like token things like civic improvement schemes? Instead of focusing on that, focus on stuff that's actually been happening, which really works. For instance, in Germany, like a social economic model where workers are on boards, like democratizing
why not
capital,
both?
maybe like anarcho-syndicalism. That could be something that could actually
No,
happen.
for me, anarcho-syndicalism belongs to an earlier time.
At least like workers on boards, like Germany have done.
Sure.
Like
But
that would
that's
be
still capital.
more realistic
Yeah.
instead of going after the communist trap of kind of private property, or like John
No,
McDonnell
I,
stuff.
not only do I not just attack private property,
We
I'm
can
also
improve our
I'm not only just attacking the state as well, and state property. I'm really against any kind of oppression, any kind of hierarchy at all. I really
yeah,
think
but
you've got to be
instead of
very
going that
radical.
far line, what about
But
just
the
first-
thing about having workers on the boards of directors, like they do in Germany, that's great. That's fantastic. That's not even anarcho-syndicalism. You'd call that like a very advanced level of trade unionism.
Right.
Yeah, Britain is long overdue to have
we're so far
workers
behind.
on the boards of control.
Although it's 50 years since we were on the moon coming up, and having workers who are not necessarily the best advocates of pushing technology.
Of course they
are.
Of course they are.
But I'm saying like
I mean,
I'll give you an
Stevenson,
example.
the
Can I give
people
you an
in the Industrial Revolution went above the work. That's Stevenson.
No, the thing is about this, the Industrial Revolution would not have happened without workers. Technology doesn't produce anything. People produce things, and they use technology to get that out. I really believe that
It just
labour is...
produces high utilization of capital. That's what technology is.
I know, but at the end of the day, the thing that produces value in the society is not capital, it's not technology, it's not even land and nature, it's human labour. Human labour is what creates value in society. And so, yes, having workers on the board of directors, workers want to push for more technological change.
be a realistic step.
Not always. Not always do they stand behind. Now, what you said about technological change happening, this does lead me to say that syndicalism is not really relevant to today. Syndicalism was the belief that, yes, trade unions should run the economy, basically. We shouldn't trust the capitalist class to do it. It really should be workers controlling the economy. Then you add anarchism into the mix, and then you say, let's just get rid of the state and have the trade unions control everything. Not just the economy, but defense, transport, all the other areas of life. The workers, the people, essentially. That was anarcho-syndicalism, and it worked very well in Spain in the 1930s. For about 10 months before it was crushed by the fascists, it worked remarkably well. But then something has changed. Workers have changed today. There isn't that level of class consciousness you have in Britain today that you had in maybe when you were a child, for example, when you were a kid. There isn't that level of radical class consciousness that workers have. Workers today they identify primarily as something else, not workers. They see themselves more as husbands, fathers, hobbyists. They go beyond their class status. The division between proletarian and capitalist had a very big importance to people 100 years ago, and it just doesn't have that same hold on people today. So I think we've got to broaden people out. That's why I say local communities, because that embraces people on all their different dimensions. Not just their economic status, but all their various dimensions. Take care, my friend.
My only point to you is that radicals such as yourself and momentum stuff will be far more effective instead of being so hardline and taking a far view. Just argue for corrective to constrain capitalism as opposed to arguing for communism. That's a dirty word now, basically.
Well, I'm not a communist.
You know what
A
I'm saying?
communalist is not a communist. Communism has been tainted by its association with Bolshevism. Really, when people say they're criticizing communism, they're not criticizing a society where everyone's sharing and you're getting according to your needs and you're giving according to what you can. What they're doing is they're criticizing Bolshevism. They're criticizing an idea of a maximal leader controlling the party, which controls the labor army, right? And Lenin laid the groundwork for this very efficiently, and Stalin just ramped it up by 500%, basically, is what happened. For me, that's Bolshevism. Communalism is not about Bolshevik. It's not Bolshevik, and it's not even communist, because it allows for things like maybe in some places the market does make sense. maybe in deciding what kind of biscuit people should eat. That maybe we should leave that up to buying and selling in the marketplace. Fine, it's a relatively small point, so we allow that. You know, that's what I think a communalist would be a bit more easygoing on that.
Isn't communalism highly dependent? Because you mentioned before the book that researches the various communities around the world, in like remote places, right? But those communities are very much homogenous, right? All the people are very much the same. They're raised very equal, right? They have the same belief system.
Tribal
and
trust.
exactly. And if there's no space for diversity, for different thinkers, right? But and I think that's possible because they all work towards the same goal. But now, if you look at like Britain today, it's a very diverse country. It's not homogenous.
No, London is another country, yeah.
Yeah, right. And it's
unrealistic.
Different religions, different races, everything. I mean, how would you? And you also have different like ethical standards. I mean, on the one side, you have like somebody preaching LGBT, and rights for.
So this is, okay,
but then on the other side,
sorry,
you have fundamental Islamists, right? That would kill all the gays and everything, right? So how are you going to establish a system like that in a sort of heterogeneous?
Oh, you got your work cut out
right?
for you. If you're someone who opposes hierarchy, and is a believer in equality,
because the only thing that can force this, the only system is a totalitarian system, right? You can unite people under like system like I don't know Soviet Union or former Yugoslavia, right?
But then there's violence.
So no, I don't
exactly.
think.
And people would say, "Don't tell me what to do."
Actually,
right?
There's two separate problems. You've identified two problems with communalism, which it tries to deal with very well, in my opinion. So the first one is what happens when all the local communities become very parochial and they're cut off from each other, right?
Yeah.
They become maybe ethnically very closed off. Well, for me, this needs to be overcome by confederations, confederal relationships that mitigate differences and foster that like diversity. I mean, I'd like to see London become like a mosaic, a beautiful tapestry. I really would. A beautiful blend of cultures. That's what you need. You need an overarching confederal structure. By the way,
these cultures coexist. That's the question,
they can coexist. There's nothing that says that you can have diversity and also have social tension. It's not true. I mean, like for example, London used to be a lot more racially tense. It's still pretty racial. I mean, London is very racially, ethnically tense today. There is a lot of that, like, you know, suspicion and distrust and mutual fear. There is that feeling, but it's declined massively since my parents first came to London. It came in the 70s from South Africa. I mean, it's completely different now. It just takes time. Communities take time to learn to trust each other and realize that they're not that different, really. They may look different and eat different food, but they're the same human values. We have the same desires for like love, for freedom, for equality. Yeah, we do not. I think we do. Basically, all humans have the same. For food and water.
Basic needs.
For example, for sex as well. For a feeling of respect. That's a human universal. The desire for respect. The question is, how do you get these met in different ways and not have conflict? That's difficult. I'm not saying it's easy. Going to your other question about, what are you talking about, Lgbt rights and
but I didn't mean it
fundamental Islam.
specifically.
So I'm not in a communalist society. You would never force people to be okay with being with LGBT stuff, right? You would never force people to be against radical Islam if they want to be. Okay, this is where you have to divide the two spheres. Oh, actually, there's three spheres. If you're a communalist, you believe that there's three spheres that divide up society. There's the social, the political, and the state. The social sphere is like, it's where the economy is really. It's like, what you do in your private life. It's the world of production. It's the world of, leisure and your private life, basically. Then there's the political sphere. You step out of that world and you go into the public sphere. Speaker's Corner is somewhere like getting there. You're getting there and you're starting to relate to people on the basis of their shared citizenship. Like, we're all humans, we're all citizens of this country or wherever. We may look different and all the rest, but we're here to debate things that matter to all of us. Things like Julian Assange's potential extradition, like climate change being denied, like 40,000 Venezuelans being killed by Trump sanctions, something I haven't heard in the media discussed at all. This is what the public sphere is about, discussing these kind of issues, right? Then there's the state, and I don't see the state as together with the political world. This is the problem with a lot of anarchists. They mix up the state with political. Political means, for me, direct democratic control by the people of their society, of their community. The state is not like that at all. The state is a centralized, professionalized body of men and women. They can be elected or not elected. Either way, it's a centralized body. They're the policymakers. They don't give any policymaking power to the public. So for me, I'd like to see us use these kind of concepts, or at least just think about them, reflect on them, that things are not so mixed up. Very often, even social scientists, they mix up these words all the time. Social, political, state. They just mix it up all together, but it's not necessarily the same. So for example, going back to your thing about radical Islam and LGBT rights, you believe what you want to believe, right? That's the social sphere. Your private beliefs and what you value and what you care, the person you want to marry, the person you want to have sex with, the kinds of friends you choose, the kind of games you play, the kind of job you choose, these are all your business, and no one should sit in judgment about your choices in that life and your personal choices, unless those personal choices are hurting someone else. If they're physically like causing intimidation or harm or something, then I think then the public has the right to intervene. But generally, no one should be judging anyone else on that basis. And in fact, I would even go so far to say, the more we choose our partners and our friends and our loved ones, not on the basis of age, religion, gender, ethnicity, the more we choose our partners on that basis, not on that basis, but on the basis of our shared humanity, that for me is a measure of how humane we are, how civilized, that's that potential for freedom being lived out. So it's best degree.
Some people can't intervene like you're suggesting they should. And therefore, I don't want to advocate the state, but that's when the state comes into it. Yeah? When everybody agrees that it's wrong, but everybody finds it stop something.
Of course.
Then the state comes in.
Yeah. Take care, man. It was what's your questions.
What's your name?
Kyle. Yeah,
Hi.
Kyle Farron. Yeah. Very nice to meet you. Thanks a lot, guys.
You come often?
I'm here every week if you want to come back. I'll be like nice to debate again. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'm here every week, everyone. If you ever want to debate. Sorry. Limits to Growth. I've read it. Yeah, it's good. So yes, going back to your question about intervention. Yeah, I mean, yes, we allow the state to intervene on certain issues because, we can't adjudicate them ourselves in our private life. So we allow the state to come in and, play that role. But that's because we haven't developed a fully functional political sphere where we can do it ourselves. For now, we have to rely on an elected body of men and women to take that active role. Ideally, I'd like to move to a space where we just do it ourselves through our political assemblies, through our public meetings. People at Speaker's Corner, they say, "Oh, that sounds like ancient Greece, right?" Like, yeah, in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't.
It does sound like mob rule as well.
Yeah, this is mob rule. This is what the founding fathers of the US were talking about. This is what they were frightened of when they were against democracy, very clearly against democracy. They called it mob rule. They were in favor of a republic, responsible men controlling things. Calling things a mobocracy or calling it mob rule. That's an old, very conservative. You don't mind me saying, very conservative attack. And it's an ad hominem attack. What you're saying there is that people are a mob. You're saying that people can't get together and use dialogue, reason, rationality to come to a conclusion about a given matter. And they can't learn from their mistakes as well. You're saying that there's no room for development, potential unfolding of human reason. When you just describe things as a mob, and you know what? I'll go back to some of the great uprisings of history. Go back to 1381 and the Peasants' Revolt. Go back to the Jacqueries in France in the 14th century. Or go, if you want to go a bit later, to the uprisings in 1871 in Paris. You want to look at the American Rebellion, the Shays Rebellion in America. I've studied all of these rebellions. I've spent a lot of the last few years carefully studying these uprisings and rebellions to figure out what I can learn from them, where they went wrong, why they didn't succeed in bringing about more freedom. But something I did learn throughout all of them, they were not mobs. They were not mobs. They were often very organized. These uprisings were often very organized and had their roots very deep into communities. When one uprising failed, they would retreat back to their pubs, their union halls, their working men's clubs, and they would rebuild, they would reorganize, and they would talk and they would relate to each other. A lot of the people who took part in these, they were very organized. And in and among these rebellions, you had peppered intellectuals. You had the radical preachers during the 1381 rebellion in England. People like John Ball, who said, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" You had these people peppered around, right? And they were kind of like the yeast that made the cake rise, really. They were there to very often if you look at paintings of rebellions, there's always a figure that's singled out as a leader. And you need that leader. This is a problem I have with anarchism again. They don't trust leaders. But you need these leaders. These are the intellectually developed poets, playwrights, actors. Often they're in the artistic world, but they can be scientists as well, writers, journalists. These are the ones who are there at a rebellion, I saw this at
Are
Extinction
you
Rebellion.
finding a role for yourself by naming these sorts of bohemian
Of course, that's
people?
what is a speaker doing at Speaker's Corner? That's what they're doing. They're all trying to speak the truth and expose the lies that they see around them. You know, that's what they're trying to do.
Well, not namely, they're trying to work out things for themselves in front of an audience.
Yeah, they can do that, and you have seen this I think this is one reason why Speaker's Corner has declined. It's because speakers are very much using it as a personal experience. They go out there and they're using it like a therapy, as a way to get out their feelings. They're not there for any mission to socially reconstruct society, but they have that responsibility to do that, and I think they need to live up to that. I'm talking here not about the religious preachers, they're on a whole different mission themselves. I'm talking here about the ones who deal with secular issues. You're not here just to test out your own ideas. That's one thing you do as a speaker, I'll tell you, at Speaker's Corner. You are here to test out your ideas and find out what works and what doesn't work.
You are here.
But I'm not here primarily for myself. I'm really not. But you know, by being here, you jeopardize all kinds of.
You're not here for the ideology. You're here.
Yes, for the people. I know you can choose to believe in that or not.
Rhetorical garbage.
Oh, fine. You can believe that. That's what you want to believe, and that's fine. Go ahead. But I'm really here because I'd like to see people. I want to stir up indignation. This is what Oscar Wilde was doing. Oscar Wilde dedicated his entire career to stirring people up emotionally so that they would act and make their lives better, on a personal level and on a social level. He was not just a very avant-garde experimental artist on the personal front, dealing with sexual and social issues there. He was also an intensely political man as well. You know, he was talking about social, read Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. You'll see what I'm talking about. He had a social commitment. And I see, sadly, left and right, radicals fleeing this. Radicals have just withdrawn from this completely. And it's sad, because capitalism has taken its toll, I think. It really has. It's very good at keeping activists divided. You see this in London. You've got activists dealing with housing issues on one side, then on the climate, then on gay issues, then on racism. You've got all these different, and they never talk to each other. They never see what they have in common.
How did capitalism nipped in there, destroyed something and nipped out again? What was that? I didn't quite get that.
Well, what does capitalism do? It isolates people down into individuals, individual workers and consumers. It tries to separate social bonds and replace them with buying and selling relationships. That's what it does. And we don't even live in a capitalist economy. We live in a capitalist society. It's penetrated so far into our ways of thinking, even our whole psychology. I've had people at Speaker's Corner say, I don't buy that idea. And I'm like, I'm not selling anything at Speaker's Corner. I'm doing it for free. All right? So I'm not here to sell something. And now it's taken its toll on activists. Activists have been becoming withdrawn into themselves and becoming more interested in their personal expression and personal fulfillment and individual action. Anarchism has always been like this to an extent. It's like a very extreme form of liberalism, really. It's always been this individualistic philosophy. I have to say I reject it entirely. If we want to see an end to climate change, if we want to see an end to the massive rape of the environment currently underway, where millions of animals and species go extinct every decade, then we're going to have to think about things on a social level. It has to go beyond just recycling, or going beyond just sporadic uprisings here and there, like Extinction Rebellions, like, Frolic. That was a very juvenile frolic, basically. It was a party. And it lasted a few days and it caused a bit of traffic disruption. Things have to go beyond that. I really would like to see an ideology that catapults us beyond the current way of thinking to something far less individualistic and also less authoritarian as well. This is where the Marxists have their problem. The Marxists are they want to organize people into hierarchies. Can I be a Kylist as well? Kylist? No, you can't be a
He's
Kylist.
only here to mock. Well, I'm here to mock under the guise of not mocking. We love you, Kylie. Stop it.
So you don't know what the issue of climate change is. What are you proposing as the solution?
Listen, the solution's not as clear. It's really irritating. On the issue of nuclear weapons, it's very clear. Just disarm. It's a very simple issue. Climate change is a bit more complicated, and it's not so simple.
Yeah,
you've got to not only cut down carbon emissions to zero, you've got to stop emitting carbon. We've actually already pumped so much carbon into the atmosphere, we have to start taking it out of the atmosphere, sequestering it, putting it in the ground. That's how bad it's gotten with climate change. But it's possible. I believe that not only is climate change happening, it's being caused by very wealthy human beings, and it's something that's going to get worse if we don't do something about it. And the most important thing I'll say, the fourth thing, is that you can do something about it.
Yes, it's
through
farting cows and
collective
farting
action.
cars.
Farting cows and farting cars.
Not on my watch.
That's a human thing right there. That's human. That was created by us. And what we can create, we can undo. It's possible. We don't have to. It's not a genie that's just come out of the bottle. Now we can't control it.
And genies coming out of bottles. There's a bit of carbon. exploded.
Yeah, that's a form of carbon coming out. Yeah.
But you're right. It is big companies backed by governments that allow that to happen.
It is.
But also, what I'm trying to understand, what do you think is driving that?
The thing is to do what I just said about taking carbon out of the atmosphere.
It really is.
To do what I said
is
about,
laziness,
you know, to
because
do
they
that.
can change it, but they'll say, they'll just go, oh, well, they'll kick the can down the road. They'll say,
Exactly, yeah.
2050 will do that.
We always, yeah.
And then that sort of quietens it down because they say, well, you have to do it.
It's not laziness per se.
But it is.
A lot of these companies are going around the world, digging up places and stuff.
Because they've already organised themselves with their trade deals and their tariffs and their it can only happen in 2050 because we've got to sort out, we've got to get rid of all this stuff we've done first, and then we'll gradually bring in slowly the new way of dealing with it. Which
You've got to remember, the British ruling class is committed to 3% growth of GDP every year. That's what they're committed. That's what's required for capitalism to work and for people not to go out of a job and for businesses to stay. 3% growth every year. That is in direct contradiction to the environment. You cannot have constant growth on a planet which has only got so many resources. You can have an abundance, you can share with everybody, but you have to get rid of that constant need for growth and production. And I'll point out wasteful production as well. Wasteful, because a lot of the clothes we buy are crap. I mean, they're designed to be crap, so we keep buying them. That's the whole point. Otherwise, the system doesn't grow. That's the problem. It's like a cancer. It's a cancerous system. I really believe that. But the thing is, I wanted to say something to what you said earlier. I can say, yes, take carbon out of the atmosphere. Let's cut down on carbon emissions. Let's bring about that change, maybe earlier than 2050. Let's try and make it 2020, 2025.
Well,
it's a big push.
Trees are doing it
but
now.
the thing is, we can only do that when we have a democracy, and we don't have a democracy. You can only, people will always, like you said, kick the can down the road. They'll kick the can up to Westminster, and they'll say, why don't you guys do it? You bring about that change. But actually, it's all up to all of us. We all have to act in our local communities and democratize them, take back that power from the state, and do it for ourselves.
Well, that's kicking the can down the road.
No, it's not.
Democratise your community.
No,
that's
it's not.
a real long-term job.
Of course it is. It's painstaking work. Working with your fellow neighbours and or wherever you live, if you live in a village, and working with your village to bring about more democracy, like more power to those people, so that they can decide more issues. That's painstaking work. It takes years. But you got to do it. There's no way around it. I'm sorry, there's no shortcut. It may be easier just to stay on a ladder at Speaker's Corner and speak about it. That's what I did for years. And I realized after a while, you can't just speak, you have to actually do stuff as well. So I've tried to do that as well. Reach out to my local neighborhoods, bring them together around shared concerns, so they can start to awaken their conscience, realize they have the power. Remember, if you forget everything I've said here today at Speaker's Corner, and you just remember one thing, all of you have the power. All of you have it. I'm not just trying to be a motivational speaker or anything. It's true. It is just factually true. David Cameron doesn't magically have power coming out of his body. He didn't invade Libya, destroy Libya. He had the cooperation of thousands of people to do that. They could have chosen to withdraw that cooperation and not done that. All right? That's what power is about. It's given by the consent of the public. Even under the most ruthless dictatorships. A really ruthless dictator, someone like Adolf Hitler, required cooperation by thousands of people, millions of people, to get his society, his social vision into action. If they all just withdrew that cooperation, then you don't have that power. It's very simple. I wouldn't be able to speak to you guys if you all just left. Right?
Yes, but
I have the power to have your ears because you're here voluntarily.
If there was black shirts all around there pushing us back to listen, which is what happened.
Yes, you can use physical force.
You couldn't get out.
But physical violence in itself does not create power. There's a mistaken belief that power comes from that physical force. That's just not how it works. You can't actually, you know that phrase, you can bring a horse to water but you can't make it drink? That's exactly true with human beings as well. You cannot, for example, Gene Sharp, the famous nonviolent action theorist, he says that if I have a gun and I point to you and I say, go outside and dig a hole in your back garden, you may choose not to do that. And I may just kill you, but then the hole hasn't been dug. I haven't gotten the thing I wanted. So the power, I haven't exerted that power successfully. Power comes from you agreeing to do it or not. And now you may decide I'm not going to do it, or I am going to do it because I don't want to be killed. But either way, you're choosing to do it. No one ever does anything when they don't want to do it. People always do what they want to do. They always do what they want to do.
Going back to climate change, because
you've gone off on a tangent.
Well, no, it's related to climate change. The reason why climate change is happening is because we don't have the power to decide how our economy works. If the public had the power over this economy, they ran this economy, they would not allow climate change to happen. Nobody wants to live on a dead planet. Nobody. It's only a very small group of people at the top who care more about making money and are like genocidal. That's what's happening.
But why is there a need? Why is there this belief that we have to have an increased production? Because that's what's causing it, right? Because
yeah, of course.
There's a sense of, look, we've got to have an increased sense of production.
Well, there's a mistaken belief that capitalism is the appropriate way to organise buying, like production and distribution. That for me is a mistaken belief.
There's a theory at the moment that says we haven't got capitalism at the moment because of quantitative easing. You can't really call it capitalism.
No. Capitalism requires a nanny state.
Bank controlled.
Capitalism requires a nanny state. Capitalism requires public education to brainwash people into believing that their life is about work and they have to do what the superiors tell them. That requires a lot of money to do that, paid for by the state. Capitalism requires people money from the state for apprenticeships to train up plumbers and electricians and so on to keep this whole machine going. Capitalism requires bailouts whenever it pushes the boundary too far and it creates a financial meltdown. Capitalism requires not just that, it requires warfare so that it can open up new markets in places like Iraq or Venezuela, where the markets are closed off to the world. It requires warfare to bring that about. So it requires a nanny state, big time.
Are you saying that it's this idea within capitalism that there has to be they believe that there's infinite number of needs, right? And there's limited set of resources as a principle. So there's always a need to go and
capitalism is grow or die. It's grow or die. If I have a business, if it's not growing, I'm going to go out of business.
So what's the
it's very simple.
What's the alternative?
The alternative is a steady state economy, not based on making profit, not based on buying and selling, but based on giving people what they need and getting them to work according to what they can do. For me, that's socialism, and I think that's real socialism. It's not when the government controls everything, centralized government. It's when the people directly control their resources and they decide where to put them, democratically, face to face. That for me makes more sense. It's more sensible, it's more rational to plan out these things.
No, but why,
you wouldn't like to be at that meeting.
I would.
You would.
Say, yeah, I would like to be there as well.
Why doesn't the state provide the basic needs of people and then beyond that leave it to people to work in their private sphere?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
I agree with you, why not? The state could do that as an interim measure. I would like to see the state eventually disappear, but for now, it would be good to have the state provide those basic things. Things like, I would like to see a basic income provided, where everybody in the society gets a fixed payment
not free
every
of
month.
charge. If people can
I would like to see more welfare. These things, we've got to push the boundaries further and further. Then when people start to realize that they have the power, they can bring about changes, then you can start to push them towards more and more radical change. And yes, eventually overturn the state, create something really democratic.
But what's interesting is actually there's a correlation. Like the Islamic economics, I don't know if you've ever come across any concept.
I haven't studied Islamic
But it's interesting, it's a similar sort of thing, where they say there's a limited set of needs that need to be fulfilled. And obviously people should work to try to fulfill those needs, but where the state needs to intervene, it provides where obviously some people can't. But then after that, it's left to the people that they should be able to work and be able to get whatever they need. I.e. a nice car or a bigger house or whatever, they work for it and try to achieve.
You've got to remember, Islam came about in the very early medieval period, right? At the end of the Roman Empire, beginning of the medieval period. It's much more rooted in an older worldview of balance.
Yeah.
It's got the Islamic approach to economics sounds to me like it has much more in common with Aristotle and the ancient Greek authors, and their idea that we need to have a balance with the environment. We can't have constant growth. We can't have constant desire, like wants and desires going on for infinity. It seems like it has a lot more in common with that. It doesn't seem at odds with capitalism necessarily, but it also doesn't seem entirely capitalistic.
No, it is odd actually, because the thing is, capitalism believes in the idea that obviously there's infinite set of needs, right, and wants. Islam, on the other hand, says there's a limit, right? And therefore it focuses not on production but distribution of wealth. Because it says there's enough wealth, it's not being distributed directly. But then on the other side, what it says in terms of that there is 3 levels of ownership. So within the sort of there's a state, right? And then there's the private ownership, and then there's stuff that belongs to the people. So it says natural resources, for example, things like water, gas, and these things, that they actually belong, these resources belong to all the people. And therefore the state can't privatize those, right, and sell them and give them to private companies, right? It has to use them to provide the basic needs of people, and the leftover, essentially, it can use it to sell and provide resources to the people. But then in the private sphere, it allows people to go and own things freely as they.
But just remember, if you're an Islamic country and you try and practice this, you might get your government overthrown. So this happened in 1953. Mossadegh in Iran. I think I mentioned this last time you were here, right? Yeah. There was a democratically elected leader of Iran in 1950. I think it was either 1953 or 56. I always forget. Thank you very much, sir. You're Iranian. Oh well, good timing. You arrived just as I started talking about this. This shouldn't be just something Iranians know about, and a few other countries in the Middle East. This should be something Britain knows about, especially. Britain helped to overthrow a democratically elected government in Iran in 1956. Is that what you were saying? 56. The reason was that Mossadegh had nationalized Iranian oil. There was a company called Anglo-Iranian Oil, which later became just known as BP, and the Iranian government had the cheek to say that actually we want some of those resources. We don't want it all going to the West. We don't want it all going to the United Kingdom. And the UK was horrified at this. Absolutely, they were like, no. Persian oil is ours. It's always been ours since we colonized, and it's going to be ours. So they asked for the help of the CIA, and they brought about a coup d'etat. They overthrew his government. And I believe he wasn't killed, but he had to flee and he had to leave to another country.
Yeah, and they convinced the US that Iran was going to become a Soviet ally.
Exactly. Yeah. They said, yeah, there was a communist party in Iran called the Tudeh Party, which was doing very well in the elections. There were not, at the time, the Arab world and the Persian world was very secular, nationalist, right? It wasn't like radical Islamic. It was very, very trying to take the best of the Western world. It was looking to the example of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the English Revolution even to create a constitutional, secular nation state, independent of the West. That was intolerable, absolutely intolerable. So Britain had to crush those movements, and they very often used to collaborate with radical Islamic elements to do that. So, for example, in Iran, there's a good example of this. They've collaborated. It's not just Sunni terrorist groups Britain has collaborated with. Sometimes they've done it with Shia groups as well. I think one's called Jama'at al-Islam. They've collaborated with them. In Libya, they've done the same. You've got to check all these facts for yourself to see if them show. I know this is going on record, so I'll say it on record, and I'll say it to all of you as well. If you want to find out more about this, there's a very good book called Secret Affairs: Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam. It's written by an author called Mark Curtis, who spent years in the National Archives in Britain, finding out what is it that the Foreign Office was saying about these countries. And I mean, Iran is just one example of where Islamic law is just not acceptable. The idea that the people should control their resources. No. It's not just Iran. I mean, look what's happening in Venezuela right now. It's a similar story. They want to control their oil. They don't want oil leaving, going to other countries. And they're getting punished. They're getting,
But in terms of what do you think about the banking system based upon interest and things like that?
Oh yeah, it's a horrible system, compound interest. It makes no sense to run a system based on that. What's more of a shock to me is that our system, I studied it, took a bit of time to read about the financial system in Britain, how it works. It's very similar to the one in Europe, and it's very similar to the one in America. They all use the same basic system, but it's separated, right? We create money out of nothing. Private banks create money out of nothing. It's incredible. Literally, when you go to an ATM and you're looking at your bank account, that money doesn't exist. It only exists once you've taken it out of the bank. It literally gets created into existence. And then you say, oh, what about inflation? Wouldn't this create massive inflation? Well, it doesn't create massive inflation because the value of money is controlled by the interest rates are controlled by those banks as well. That's private commercial banks. You're giving an incredibly important social tool, money. You're giving the power to create that to private interests. These private interests do not serve the public. They serve their shareholders, their profit-making institutions. They're legally mandated, in the United States, they're legally mandated to provide a return to their shareholders. It's not so bad in Britain and Europe, but in America they have to provide so they're going to create money in the interests of their shareholders. They're not going to do it in the interest of financial stability. you want to find out more about this, there's a very good organisation. It's called Positive Money, and they've been producing articles and reports about this for years, trying to show you how crazy it is that we give the power to create money to private institutions. It should be the state which decides how much money there is in the economy.
But should it be pegged on something that's intrinsic, has intrinsic value?
People say it should be pegged to gold because gold has an intrinsic value. I don't believe that. It doesn't have to be pegged to gold necessarily. It can be pegged to, it can just be controlled by the bank centrally. That's rational, that's planned at the central level. That for me makes more sense. But we haven't learned our lesson, we're just continuing on blindly, and I just wish we wouldn't. I'd like to see us all look at the situation carefully, and at least, you know what you can do? By educating yourself more about this, you're like changing things. People think, oh, when I read an article about the banking system or about Venezuela or Iran, what difference does it make? I'm not going to change the policy. Actually, it does change the policy. If you're a policymaker, you're sitting in Westminster or Washington, or you're sitting in Brussels, and you're going to make a decision about finance or about invading this or that country, you're going to think about what the public knows. If the public knows more about these systems, they're not going to take that risk and do something unpopular, because they want to get elected again. These governments, they want to be elected. They don't want to be kicked out of office. So they do care about what you think. For example, the Iraq War was so unpopular that British governments have to be now very careful before they launch an attack on another country. They have to use a lot more careful propaganda and manipulation of parliament. It's not as easy as it used to be. That's because the public came out in full force. 2 million people.
Come take over everything from your community. Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Today, and listen them back to the Mosaic Law, where the Mosaic Law has been fulfilled by Jesus Christ. We are not taught to stone people to death. We are taught to love our enemies, to bless those who curse us. This is what we follow.
It says that there, though. It says that there.
And what's the reason? And what's the reason? What's the reason?
You told me it didn't say that.
What is the reason why they're stoned to death? The reason why they're stoned to death is not just because of unbelief, which is what you said last week. The reason why they're stoned to death is because they're taking people